When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world thought the war was over. But for thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft from deadly Messerschmitt Bf-1, 109s to terrifying Me-2, 162 jets, their real fate was only just beginning. Some were hidden in forests, some were secretly shipped across oceans, some were destroyed in explosions so powerful that locals felt the shockwaves miles away, and a few vanished without a trace. What happened to these machines of destruction wasn't just history. It became one of the most secretive cleanups the world has ever seen. When the war ended in 1945, the Allied forces stepped into a Germany that looked defeated on the surface. But beneath the ruins lay something far more valuable than cities or territory. It was the hidden heart of the Luftwaffe, thousands of aircraft, technology decades ahead of its time, and research that had the potential to shape the future of aviation. The first key mission for the Allies was not rebuilding Europe, nor celebrating victory. It was a frantic, secretive hunt to capture as many Luftwaffe planes as possible before anyone else could reach them. Those aircraft were no longer just war machines. They were keys to knowledge, power, and global dominance in the skies. Imagine American, British, and Soviet teams spreading across Germany like treasure hunters, except their treasure was steel, engines, blueprints, and half-finished prototypes. In abandoned hangars, they found Me-2, 162 jet fighters sitting silently with dust on their wings. They found experimental aircraft with swept wings that looked like they came from the future, bombers with radical designs, and engines that no Allied nation had ever imagined could be mass-produced during the war. The more they discovered, the more urgent the race became. Each aircraft could reveal a secret: how Germany built the first functional jet fighter, how they improved aerodynamics, how their engines reached speeds previously thought impossible. This wasn't just about capturing planes. It was about denying them to rivals. As American teams marked aircraft with chalk and tagged them for shipment, British intelligence groups arrived at the same bases, sometimes just hours later, furious to find the hangars already emptied. In other parts of Germany, Soviet troops stormed factories with orders to take everything: engines, tools, metal stockpiles, workers, engineers, and even the floors of the factory if necessary. The hunt for Luftwaffe aircraft became the first silent conflict of the post-war world. The Americans launched Operation Lusty, sending pilots and specialists to locate and fly German aircraft to secure locations. These teams wandered across shattered German airfields, sometimes finding entire rows of untouched fighters that had never flown a combat mission. They found planes hidden in forests, buried under camouflage nets, or placed inside barns by retreating German units. And every time they found a new aircraft, they documented it, dismantled it, or flew it back to Allied lines. The U.S. wanted to dominate the future of jet aviation, and the Germans had laid the blueprint. Meanwhile, British teams, especially those in the Air Technical Intelligence Unit, competed fiercely with American units, often intercepting shipments and redirecting them to the United Kingdom. The British were desperate to learn how German jets handled in real flight, how their engines performed, and what weaknesses they had. Every captured aircraft meant one more advantage in the coming global power struggle. In this feverish race, the Allies weren't just seizing machines. They were seizing the future. Germany's aircraft, once symbols of terror, had become prizes of unimaginable value. The hunt for the Luftwaffe's secrets was ruthless, competitive, and intensely strategic, setting the stage for the aviation revolution that followed. The moment the Allies realized how advanced German aviation truly was, a new question emerged: what should they do with all these aircraft? Destroying them would erase valuable knowledge, but keeping them required resources, manpower, and secure facilities. Yet the truth was undeniable: these planes were worth far more than their metal. They represented millions of dollars of research, experimentation, and engineering brilliance that the world had never seen before. And so began one of the most expensive and carefully planned operations of the post War period, transporting German aircraft across oceans to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. For the Americans, this was not optional. It was essential. If they wanted to lead the world into the jet age, they needed to understand every aspect of German aviation. Engineers studied German engines and were stunned by their complexity. America had money, factories, and manpower, but Germany had knowledge, and knowledge was priceless. Planes were dismantled piece by piece, wings separated from fuselages, engines crated like precious artifacts, and everything shipped to ports for loading onto massive cargo vessels. Some aircraft were even flown across Europe to safe zones, where they were prepared for transatlantic transport. The cost was enormous. Every aircraft needed secure packaging, manpower to dismantle it, documentation for each component, and entire teams to reassemble them once they reached American soil. But the Americans didn't hesitate. They transported dozens of Me-2, 162 jet fighters, the revolutionary Aroto bombers, advanced Focke-Wulf prototypes, and engines that looked almost alien to Allied engineers. Even experimental aircraft that never saw combat were shipped, because their designs hinted at the direction future aviation would take. In the United Kingdom, similar efforts were underway, though on a smaller scale. British intelligence prioritized obtaining aircraft that could teach them how to defend against jet fighters and rockets in the future. Each plane was a classroom, each engine a lecture in engineering superiority. British test pilots risked their lives flying unfamiliar German designs, sometimes experiencing catastrophic engine failures mid-flight. Still, the British invested heavily in transporting these aircraft because they knew the world was shifting. Whoever controlled the skies would control everything that came next. Meanwhile, the Soviets took their own approach, fast, aggressive, and uncompromising. Instead of selectively choosing aircraft to ship, they dismantled entire factories and shipped them east. Trains loaded with machines, engines, tools, and even German workers left for Soviet territory. Some aircraft were flown directly to Russia, while others were studied and copied before being absorbed into the early Soviet aviation programs. What the Soviets lacked in resources, they made up for in determination. They wanted to leapfrog into the jet age, and German technology became their shortcut. Every nation that touched German aircraft poured money, manpower, and attention into preserving them. But this wasn't just about aircraft. It was about national pride and global power. These planes carried the secrets of the future, and the Allies were willing to spend whatever it took to unlock them. As the months after the German surrender passed, the Allies faced a growing problem. There were simply too many Luftwaffe planes to manage. Airfields across Germany looked like metal forests, with wings stretching across runways, fuselages stacked beside hangars, and forgotten aircraft scattered in fields like abandoned relics. Many were too damaged to fly, others too experimental to risk testing, and countless more were duplicates of models the Allies had already studied. At first, commanders tried to catalog everything, but the numbers were overwhelming. Thousands of fighters, bombers, jets, and prototypes stood silent, slowly deteriorating under the changing weather. Soon, the decision was made. The majority of these aircraft would be destroyed, not preserved. The destruction wasn't random. It was a massive, organized process. Allied engineers and demolition teams moved from airfield to airfield, evaluating which aircraft held intelligence value and which were simply surplus. Once the lists were made, the destruction began. Entire squadrons of planes were pushed into enormous piles, their wings overlapping like fallen dominoes. Bulldozers shoved them together, forming heaps of metal that once carried pilots into some of the deadliest battles of the war. When the piles reached monstrous heights, explosives were planted beneath them. Locals who lived miles away recalled hearing the detonations, feeling the earth tremble as fireballs rose into the sky. It was as if the war's ghosts were being burned away. Other aircraft were destroyed more quietly. Fuel was poured over them and lit, creating giant bonfires of aluminum and steel. The flames consumed the fabric components, bubble canopies melted like wax, and engines cracked under the heat. The smoke drifted across the countryside, the last breath of machines that once terrorized Europe. Soldiers watched silently as the aircraft burned, knowing they were erasing technology that had once been Germany's pride. At some airfields, bulldozers were used to crush planes directly into the soil. The heavy machines passed over wings, flattening them with ease, and pushed fuselages into trenches dug specifically for disposal. Once buried, the pits were covered with earth, turning former airbases into grassy mounds, hiding the remains of hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft. Decades later, metal detectors and excavation teams would uncover parts of these forgotten planes, still lying where the Allies left them. Not all the destruction came from fire and explosives. Some aircraft were simply abandoned. With no fuel, no spare parts, and no maintenance crews, the Allies allowed them to rot naturally. Rain seeped into the engines, rust spread across the metal skin, and plants began to grow around the wheels. Photos from that era show once feared fighters standing crooked, their landing gear collapsing as time consumed them. The decision to destroy so many aircraft wasn't made lightly, but the Allies knew that leaving advanced German technology lying around posed enormous risks. Enemy nations could recover it, rogue groups could use it, and unrest in post-war Europe made security fragile. The destruction was brutal, efficient, and necessary in the eyes of military leaders. In a matter of months, thousands of Luftwaffe planes that had once dominated the skies were reduced to rubble, ash, and forgotten scraps buried beneath silent fields. As the Allies gained control of Germany's airfields and factories, it became clear that the planes were only half the story. The real treasure lay in the minds of the engineers who built them and the pilots who flew them. These men carried secrets that couldn't be boxed, shipped, or dismantled. They held the answers to questions every major power desperately wanted to uncover. How had Germany developed jet fighters so rapidly? How were their rocket systems designed? What aerodynamic tricks allowed their aircraft to outperform Allied machines early in the war? To unlock these mysteries, the Allies launched some of the most secretive intelligence operations of the entire post-war era. Teams of interrogators and technical officers moved swiftly, finding German engineers wherever they had scattered. Many had fled the cities before the collapse, hiding in villages, forests, or even underground bunkers. When they were located, they weren't treated like ordinary prisoners of war. They were assets, high-value, irreplaceable sources of knowledge. They were taken to secure compounds and questioned for days, sometimes weeks. Interrogators read through piles of technical documents with them, asking them to explain complex systems, recall testing procedures, and outline unfinished designs that never made it into production because the war ended too soon. Some engineers cooperated willingly, realizing that their work could save their lives or protect their families. Others resisted at first, but the Allies were patient. They offered safety, food, and shelter. Many German scientists eventually understood that their only path forward was to share what they knew. Slowly, bit by bit, the Allies began piecing together secrets that the Luftwaffe had guarded fiercely during the war. Then came the pilots' men who had risked everything in the skies. They understood not just how the aircraft were built, but how they behaved under pressure, how they stalled, how they climbed, where they were strongest, and where they were dangerously weak. Allied intelligence units sought out test pilots in particular. These pilots had flown prototypes that most Luftwaffe fighter groups never even saw. Some had tested rocket-boosted interceptors, high-speed jet fighters, and unproven aircraft with radical designs. Their knowledge was priceless. They could describe how a jet responded at takeoff, how its engines heated at full throttle, and what happened when a pilot pushed the aircraft beyond its limits. The Allies also discovered engineering teams that had been working on secret projects hidden deep in mountains or forests. Some of these projects were incomplete aircraft, others were wind tunnel experiments, and a few were designs that had never left paper. The engineers behind these concepts were immediately placed under tight surveillance and questioned carefully. Every calculation, every sketch, every scrap of research was collected. These intelligence operations were not simple interviews. They were strategic missions designed to transfer entire fields of knowledge from one nation to another. The Allies wanted to ensure that German aviation brilliance would never threaten the world again. But more importantly, they wanted that brilliance to serve their own future ambitions. The engineers and pilots who once fought for the Luftwaffe now became unwilling contributors to a new era of aviation, shaping the very aircraft that would dominate the skies in the decades to come. While thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed or taken apart for study, a few escaped this fate through chance, timing, or sheer luck. These survivors, scattered, abandoned, forgotten, would decades later become some of the rarest and most valuable artifacts of the entire war. Yet their survival was anything but simple. Every aircraft that still exists today endured a strange journey of neglect, rediscovery, risky transport, and painstaking restoration. Their stories reveal how close the world came to losing these machines forever, and how determined people were to preserve the last echoes of a vanished air force. At the war's end, certain aircraft were marked for special preservation by Allied intelligence teams. These were the rare models, the experimental prototypes, the advanced jets that represented leaps in aviation technology. But even being marked as valuable didn't guarantee safety. Many were left in temporary storage facilities, old hangars, barns, or makeshift shelters on former Luftwaffe bases. With supply shortages and the chaos of rebuilding Europe, these locations were poorly secured. Rain leaked through roofs, windstorms tore at the structures, and birds nested in the cockpits of once deadly fighters. Some planes were forgotten for so long that nature claimed them. In remote forests, hunters stumbled upon aircraft half covered in leaves, their paint peeling and metal rusting under decades of exposure. In Norway, cold climates preserved certain aircraft almost perfectly. Frozen mud had sealed them like time capsules, keeping their engines intact. When explorers uncovered them years later, they were shocked to find cockpits with gauges still readable, seats still firm, and components that could be restored. Recovering these aircraft was a dangerous process. In several instances, teams had to drag wrecks out of swamps where they had sunk during forced landings. The mud held them so tightly that heavy machinery struggled to lift them without tearing off wings or breaking the fuselage. Other aircraft were pulled from lakes where they had rested for decades, lying silent in cold water until divers located them. Bringing them to the surface required precision, patience, and nerves of steel. Some rose intact, dripping and ghostly, while others disintegrated as soon as they met fresh air. Once recovered, these aircraft faced the second battle restoration. Technicians spent thousands of hours repairing corroded metal, rebuilding broken engines, and searching across continents for missing parts that no longer existed. Restoration teams sometimes had to handcraft components based on old blueprints or photographs. The goal wasn't always to make them fly again, but to bring them back to a state where their history could be seen, understood, and preserved. Today, the surviving Luftwaffe aircraft displayed in museums across the world are more than machines. Each represents a series of miracles, avoiding destruction, surviving the elements, being rediscovered by the right people, and being carefully restored to honor a part of aviation history that nearly vanished forever. These rare survivors stand not as symbols of power, but as reminders of how fragile history can be, and how close the world came to losing these last witnesses of a long, fallen air force. Even after the major post or operations ended, Germany's skies continued to whisper secrets that had been left behind. Hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft had not been destroyed, transported, or documented. Instead, they had simply disappeared into the shadows of history. Some were abandoned during hurried retreats. others hidden by desperate crews hoping to preserve them, and many more simply lost in remote landscapes where no one thought to look. What followed in the decades after the war was a series of unexpected discoveries, moments where forgotten aircraft emerged from forests, lakes, and frozen landscapes like relics waking from a long sleep. Many of these aircraft were found in the most unlikely places. Hikers in dense forests stumbled upon planes with trees growing straight through their fuselages. Metal frames sat warped under the pressure of decades, their wings covered in moss, their cockpits filled with soil and roots. Some had landed there intentionally during the final days of the war, when fuel shortages forced pilots to glide into whatever clearing they could find. Others crashed in storms or during chaotic evacuations. These sites became natural graves, untouched and silent until explorers uncovered them years later. But not all discoveries were on land. In Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, divers searching lakes and deep waters encountered underwater silhouettes that once ruled the sky. Many of these aircraft had broken through thin winter ice during emergency landings, sinking instantly. Yet cold water preserved them far better than air or soil ever could. When divers illuminated the wrecks with flashlights, they saw painted markings still intact and propellers resting peacefully in the dark. Recovering these aircraft was a challenge unlike any other. Salvage teams built flotation rigs, cranes, and underwater harnesses to lift them without tearing their fragile structures apart. Each retrieval became a historical resurrection, revealing machines untouched since the war's final moments. Then there were the Arctic discoveries. Remote military outposts built during the war were abandoned quickly when Germany surrendered. In places like northern Norway or the far edges of the Eastern Front, aircraft remained exactly where they were last parked. Frozen winds preserved them, snow packed around their wheels, and ice sealed their interiors. Some were found decades later with their controls still smooth, their instrument panels perfectly readable, and their paint barely faded. These aircraft looked more like they had been frozen in time than left to deteriorate. In other cases, treasure hunters and historians followed rumors passed down by villagers who had seen German planes land in fields or forests as children. These tales led to remarkable finds: engines hidden underground, fuselage sections tucked behind collapsed barns, and entire aircraft concealed beneath landslides or overgrowth. Each discovery added new pieces to a puzzle that the world thought was already complete. But perhaps the most fascinating part of these rediscoveries was what they revealed about the closing days of the war. Each abandoned aircraft carried a final story: panic, escape, retreat, or last attempts to hide valuable technology. These silent wrecks, rediscovered decades later, told truths that no document ever recorded. Today, these lost aircraft stand in museums as survivors not only of war, but of time itself. They are reminders that history never fully disappears. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath soil, water, or ice, until the world is ready to listen again.